Asato ma sadagamaya tamaso maham jyotirgamaya mrityormam amritam gamaya avir maehi rudra yatte dakshinam mukha te namaham pahinityam. Om. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. So my subject this morning is freedom from want. And we're going to be talking about a subject that is dear to our hearts, and that is freedom. Every moment of every day, we're struggling for freedom. Expansion is life, contraction is death. We want to expand beyond our limitations. This theme of freedom is one fundamental theme of American history, and it is the fundamental theme of the Vedanta philosophy. Sanskrit word for freedom is moksha. Moksha means literally freedom, but it means particularly spiritual freedom. All of the different forms of yoga sadhana, that is of spiritual practice, have as their goal some form of spiritual freedom. Bhakti yoga, the path of devotion, well, the goal is freedom from separation from God. In Jnana yoga, well, freedom from ignorance. In Raja yoga, freedom from mental turmoil and the attainment of perfect peace. And in Karma yoga, freedom from desire. So this is what we're looking at this morning, is the subject of desire. Desire is what's the problem with desire? Let me start by saying, according to yoga, we have to kind of wrap our brains around this now, because we have a different perspective. According to yoga psychology and according to different forms of yoga sadhana, there is a problem with desire. Now, what's the problem with desire? That's that's our positioning. We have a yoga philosophy has a kind of a negative attitude towards desire. Now, what is desire? Well, desire comes from the Latin base there, de sidere. That means, maybe you've heard in astronomy, they talk about the sidereal movement of the planets and the stars. And it has to do with early times. They believed in astrology, and they believed that everyone had their lucky star. And if your lucky star was in the ascendant, then good things would come your way, and you would be happy, and you would be living a happy life. But if you were away from, that is de sidere, you were away from your lucky star, then you would find that you were suffering from ill fortune. And so you were in a condition of want. The problem with desire is it is a state of suffering. Lord Buddha begins his teaching of the Four Noble Truths with the number one, first, all is suffering. Number two, what is the cause of suffering? It is desire. A desire itself is a mental state that is a kind of suffering. That is, it's a feeling of lack. It's a feeling of want. It's a feeling, we could say, oftentimes it's prompted by a sensation of hunger or thirst. And in fact, the Buddhist philosophers referred to desire as the thirst for life. We hunger and we thirst after life. It's a kind of a feeling of suffering. Desire is not only in itself a form of suffering, but it is the cause of our bondage. Whenever we act prompted by a desire, then it leaves in our psyche an impression in our psyche, not just a memory trace, but a samskara. That means that there is an energy signature that continues to, that's called the conservation of energy. If you throw a pebble into a pond, the lake is like a pool of water. You throw a pebble in the lake, and you get the ripples. Ripples of splash. You get the ripple effect, and even after those ripples die down, even though you can't see any movement on the surface, there's a conservation of energy. That is, there is a vibration that continues on in the substance of the pond. Similarly, in the psyche, the samskara lies there like a ghost, waiting to materialize itself. And indeed, when we find ourselves in a similar situation, this is just yoga psychology. When we find ourselves in a similar situation, that desire will again rise to the surface, and we will be prompted to repeat a similar action, similar to the one which we did before. Dr. Sigmund Freud calls it repetition compulsion. That's what we call a habit. And a habit becomes an addiction and a compulsion, and it moves in a cycle that forms in those cycles we could visualize as a link in a chain. If you ever looked at a heavy chain, you may wonder how they got all those links together. Well, when they made the chain, there was a gap between each link, and you slip one into the other, and then you have to weld the link closed with intense heat. And that intense heat is like the desire that accompanies our action, that it creates a vicious circle of karma. And that there are thousands and millions of such vicious cycles or links in our lives that characterize our life and our behavior. And those are the chains that bind us down. The whole subject of freedom implies that we're in bondage. And this is the perspective of yoga psychology, the Vedanta philosophy. We may have to think a little bit about it. We're in bondage. Our subject here is freedom from want, freedom from desire. Ordinarily, we don't think, what is the bondage? We feel free. That is, we're not slaves. We're not in prison. We're not being driven along under the whip or something to build Egyptian pyramids or something like that. We feel free to think what we want to think, to say what we want to say. We feel free to go where we want to go. We feel free to do what we want to do. Yes. But there's two kinds of freedom. There's freedom to, and there's freedom from. Philosophers are interested in the second kind of freedom. Freedom from. That's a more subtle subject that we don't feel, we're not aware of until you begin to do introspection, until you begin to do spiritual practice, that we become more aware of the movement of the psyche. For example, if you go to, we don't think we want something, and in our culture, we just have a immediate satisfaction. You just go online, you point and click, and the item is delivered to your door. Where's the bondage? There's no bondage there. That's a free action. Let's say it's a very hot summer day, and you want to get a drink of Coca-Cola. So you go over to, there's a Coca-Cola machine, and you go over there and you put in your quarters in the machine, and you press the buttons, and sure enough, out rolls the bottle of Coca-Cola. You drink it, you're very happy, and you go on your way. Where's the bondage? Well, if we slow it down, maybe we consider a different scenario. You put those quarters into the machine and nothing happens. What if the machine is jammed and you're very, very thirsty and you are really looking forward to that drink? And what do you feel? You feel a little vexed. You feel a little annoyed. In fact, you may feel angry, and you may push that machine and you may kick that machine. And at that point, if you're a yogi, you stop and you're shocked to see the power that is driving you. There's a power behind that desire, which we didn't notice when it naturally cycled around. We didn't notice it. There's no inhibition. But it says in the Bhagavad Gita that the inhibition, yayato vijan pungsa sangasteshu bhajayate sangat samjayate kama, that there's a whole progression of events. When the desire is inhibited, what do you feel? Anger. And therefore you become aware of how you are being driven. In fact, we are being driven by our feeling of want, our feeling of need, our feeling of lack. That's what drives us. We're not driven by a slave master outside, but we're driven by a slave master within us. And that is the force of want and the force of desire. Thus we live our lives like puppets, being driven by the force of our wants and desires. So, and thus, we're talking here about freedom. How can we gain freedom from all of those desires? Well, there's so many desires. It's very helpful for us to, when we talk here about the feeling of desire, and it's a feeling. And when we do, if we do introspection, we know that there are many different feelings. Well, there's two generally. We can speak of emotions. When we use the word feeling, feeling refers to any number of, over 3,000 different emotions, or it may also refer to sensations. Emotions and sensations. So many of them we call these feelings, but the yoga psychologists help us in our self-analysis by reducing all of our feelings to two feelings. Sanskrit words are raga and dvesha. And Well, they're technical terms, but we don't have to remember those Sanskrit words because it just means love and hate, positive and negative, attraction and aversion. These are the two forces that determine our behavior. It's very simple. It's like the carrot and the stick. What is it that drives us? Whatever we do, well, we're drawn by things that promise to give us some enjoyment, some pleasure. We desire, we want those things. Other things that stick, that is, where things that we feel will bring us unhappiness. That is the positive affinity for happiness, being drawn to those things which are consistent with our behavior patterns and our vasanas, and aversion from those things which run counter to patterns of our behavior. Shankaracharya puts it a little more bluntly when he compares ordinary people, which means ordinary people, what do we mean here? People like us who are not enlightened. We are like animals. Particularly, we're like, Shankaracharya says, we're like a cow. Now, we don't have cows here walking around, but in old India, mother cows were walking around. And if you you see the cow, and you have a nice big bunch of green grass, you hold out that grass to mother cow, and she will come over, and you can eat the grass from your hand, and you can pet the cow. You can get some good merit for feeding the sacred cow. But the cow also knows when it sees that grass, immediately comes over to eat that grass. But if it sees a stick, it's also had other experiences. It's seen shopkeepers with a big stick in their hand. And so when the cow sees that stick, it runs away. Similar it is with ourselves. We're just like cows. That's how we live. We act raga and dvesha, attraction, desire, and aversion. Now we may, the question arises, if we want to achieve freedom from that habit which defines us, then how do we go about that? Well, the conventional wisdom is that if you have a desire, that the way to get rid of that desire is to satisfy it. And that's what happiness means. Happiness means the condition in which our desires are satisfied. Now, it's true that if you have a desire, for example, to see a particular movie, and you've read about it and you've thought about it, by the way, you wouldn't have that desire to see that movie if you hadn't read about it. That is, it's a thought, it's thinking about sense objects that's generated a desire. But about now you have the desire to see that movie, and you go to see the movie, and you watch it, and you enjoy it, you come out of the movie, so that's your desire is over. You've accomplished, you're satisfied. You don't want to go, or you need not go to see it again. And so in a sense, yes, small desires with a small d, can be satisfied, can be removed by satisfaction. But behind all of those small desires that we have, or those desires with a lowercase d, behind all those, there is desire with a capital D. That's Mahamaya. That's the desire that you feel. Maybe you found yourself one day, you had a long list of things in your busy life, of things that you wanted to do and that you were looking forward to do, and you're sitting in your living room, and you look at your list, and you realize that you've crossed everything off the list and you're bored. And everything that you can think of that you needed to do, you've done, and you can't really think of anything you want to do. But there you sit, but you're not happy. You don't know what you want to do. You don't want to do anything, but you want to do something. That's desire. That's kind of the unveiled, the deeper feeling of want that can never be removed by the satisfaction of doing something. Once upon a time, there was a barber. He was the royal barber. That is, he was employed by the Maharaja, and he'd come every day there to the palace and would wait there, and on occasion the king would require that his hair be trimmed. And so he was the barber. One day on his way home from the palace, he passed under a tree. And there, up in the branches of the tree, he heard a voice calling down to him saying, "Will you accept 7 jars full of gold?" And the barber was startled to hear that voice. He says, "Who is that?" And the voice said, "I am the Yaksha. I live here in this tree, and I'm offering you 7 jars full of gold. Will you take them?" And the barber said, "Well, yeah, sure." He didn't believe it. And he went on his way. He thought maybe he was just hearing things. But when he got home, what did he see on his front porch? He saw 7 large clay jars. And he walked over there, and he goes to the first jar, he takes the lid off. What does he see? It's filled to the brim with gold mohurs. Second jar, opens that, filled to the brim, gold. Third, gold. Fourth, gold. Fifth, sixth, gold. 7th jar, he opens that jar, full with gold. But as he looked a little bit closer, it wasn't really brim full. That was about a ½ an inch down. So he thought, my happiness is not complete. Let me fill this jar up. So he took all the change out of his pocket, went inside, got all the money that he had there, put that in the jar, didn't fill it. Called his wife. "Can you bring here some of your gold jewelry?" Yeah, she brought her gold jewelry like a good obedient wife. He put all that jewelry into that pot. Still wasn't full, and now he became kind of fixated on that. I've got to fill this pot. Time passed, and he put all of his money that he got the next day. Stopped paying bills, stopped buying food for the family. Family was going hungry. Still couldn't seem to fill up that pot. He was becoming more and more distraught. One day he went to the royal palace. He was thinking, I have to ask the Maharaja for a loan. And as soon as he came in that day, the Maharaja called him and looked, and he was surprised to see the barber. He said, "Sir," "what has happened to you? Ordinarily, you're such an easygoing, cheerful fellow, but you seem to be under great stress. You appear to be very depressed. What's wrong? You don't have the 7 jars, do you?" And the barber said, "Well, Your Majesty, I do. How do you know?" The king said, "Yeah, I had those too. And they almost bankrupted my kingdom. You have to get rid of them because they will never be filled." And so that day on the way home, the barber stopped there under the tree, called up to the Yaksha, and said, "Sir," said, "please take away these 7 jars. I don't want them anymore." "Very well," said the Yaksha. And indeed, when he got home, the jars were gone, along with all of his hard-earned money. So that's the moral of the story. Well, desire can never be fulfilled. Desire is not fulfilled by satisfaction. Once upon a time, there was another king. In ancient prehistoric times, his name was Yayati. Yayati he ruled his kingdom, led a long life, but he had an intense desire for enjoyment of life. And because he was a king, he had the means, and he had the time, and he had a whole life too. He lived a life filled with rich enjoyments, all the senses. Time passed, years passed, and he found one day that he had grown old and that he was facing imminent death. But he wanted to enjoy more of the world. And it so happens that in those ancient times, there were wizards, and there were magicians, and there were yogis who knew mantras and yantras and mudras and asanas and all, that they could teach you very easily. If you were to give them some diksha, they would teach you how to leave your own body and enter into another body. And so the king, he asked his beloved son, he had a young son who was a joy of his life. He said, son, he said, will you trade bodies with me? And the young boy didn't know. He didn't know what. Well, yes, father, all right. We can trade bodies. And so they got the priests came, instructed them how to do the meditation. Sure enough, the subtle body of the boy came out, and the subtle body of the king left his body, entered into the prince. And it wasn't long before that king, that is the prince, in the old king body soon died. But the king, now finding himself in a young body, plunged again into a life of enjoyment and sense pleasure. And time passed, and years passed. One day, the old king, he looked there, he stopped, he looked at himself in the mirror. He was shocked to see his hair was turning gray, skin was terribly wrinkled, he's looking, the eyes were a little weaker, feeling a little feebler in body, and he realized that he was facing imminent death. And he also realized simultaneously, at the same time, that his heart was still filled with desire for sense pleasures. And he was struck by the contrast and by the absurdity of it all, and by the foolishness of his futility, of his having lived two lives. And he said a famous verse there, Najatu kama kamana upabhogena shamyati havisha krishna vartmayava bhuyo eva bivardate. I don't know all the Sanskrit verses, but I know some of them, some of the famous ones. This is a famous one, where King Yayati there, he says, he realized at that moment that desire cannot be fulfilled by the satisfaction of desire. That rather, it only increases like fire when you pour butter upon it. You know how in the old Vedic sacrifices, you have a fire, and you pour the ghee on the fire, and for a moment, the fire will die down, because it has all that liquid in it. But as soon as those flames begin to gobble up that butter, then the fire burns up more brightly than before. So that was a lesson that was learned by the king Yayati. So then the question is, we still have the question, how can we become free from desire? If it's not by, maybe we could say, if putting on more fuel makes the fire burn more brightly, maybe there is another way that we could reduce the problem. We could take away some fire. Rather than putting on more fuel, we could take away some fire. That means that we could use discrimination and renunciation to reduce our desires. Rather than fulfill them, we could practice self-discipline and self-control to reduce our desires. Now that's a novel idea, but it's not really that new, because it was a great theme of the old Greek, not only the yoga psychologists, but the old Greek philosophers, the Stoics, and the Epicureans in particular. And now in spiritual circles, certainly we read Stoicism, Neo-Stoicism, and Epicureanism are kind of, that's the cutting edge again. I've been making a comeback, recycling of those old Greek philosophies they were preoccupied with a great philosophical question: how to live well. Now, by living well, they mean how to avoid suffering, how to live a life, how to flourish. And they determined there that one way to flourish is to attend to managing our desires. Epicurus, the Greek philosopher, has an interesting analysis of desires. He groups them into three. That is, what question may arise in our minds. Isn't it true that you're saying you have a negative attitude towards acting with desires, but isn't it true that there are many things which are very normal, healthy, helpful things to want? Isn't it normal and natural for us to want to get an education, to build a house, to get married, to have a family and friends, to play with our grandchildren? Aren't these all natural desires? Yes, they are. And Epicurus, in fact, he classifies all desires in a very healthy way. And that is, he talks about, number one, is desires which are natural and necessary. Number two, desires which are natural and unnecessary. And number three, desires which are unnatural, unnecessary, and vain. Now we can think of certainly desires which are natural and necessary. We have to eat and drink, we have to have a roof over our heads, and we have to have our family and friends. Those are all natural and necessary desires, for even saints and sages have to go to the supermarket and buy food and eat. And that's natural. But then there are natural and unnecessary desires, which we could include our vocation, that's necessary, going to work every day. But unnecessary, we also have avocations, natural for us to have hobbies, to have interests, to develop our talents, to do constructive things with our lives. These are natural, but they're not really necessary for our life. But then there's a third category of desires which are unnatural, unnecessary, and which bring suffering, and which we know bring suffering. Those are the things in our lives all of those negative behaviors in our lives with which we are very familiar and which we know very well are the cause of our suffering in life. Those kinds of things which have become our bad habits, our addictions, our compulsions, all of the negative things that we feel, which we're addicted to, things that we know are wrong, things that we know are not helpful, things that are not serving us, and yet we do them anyway. And here it's in this third area that lies our first major challenge to spiritual life. Don't worry about the other desires. Just focus on those things which we know very well that we have to change in order to move forward. Of course, the yogis, if we get serious, the yogis also include desires number 1 and 2 also. So that's what we push it to the logical extreme. But for now, we need not worry about those things which are natural and necessary. Focus on those desires which are vain and which are not helpful and which are not serving our higher purpose. So that's one way of dealing with desires. That is, we can use discrimination, and we can focus on those things which we know are dragging our minds down and out, and we can renounce them. Viveka and Vairagya, first 2 prerequisites for spiritual life: discrimination and renunciation of those things which do not serve our personal growth. So our subject here is freedom from want. That is, what's another way? We want to get free from this repetition compulsion. How can we do that? Well, psychologically, we know the yoga psychology employs the common sense practice of sublimation. This is a second way. That is to say, rather than try to, it's just like with diet. You know that you have to reduce your, you want to lose weight, so you have to stop eating the junk foods, but you feel hungry. And you're hungry and hungry and hungry, and it's not working. Using discrimination and saying no to yourself doesn't work. So what can you do? Well, you don't have to eat less. You can eat smarter. That means you don't have to renounce the desire. You can give the desire a higher turn. That's what's called becoming civilized, becoming more refined. We have all whatever we want. We have things which are natural and necessary. We have to eat and drink. We have to have something to drink. But rather than drink beer and wine, maybe you could use discrimination and renunciation and give those up, and rather choose to drink organic fruit juice. That would be nice. That's a big step forward. You still have satisfied your desire. And maybe you could go further. We've realized that, well, even that fruit juice is very high in calories, not really good for you. Why don't you try some nice, pure, clean, fresh water? Yeah, that would be good. Tamas, Rajas, Sattva. These are 3 good words for us to learn. Sanskrit words to move from the lower truth to the higher truth, from the lower to the higher. That's the progression. From the tamasic to the rajasic to the sattvic. And so when we find ourselves, that's all you need. You don't need organic fruit juices. You don't need tea and coffee. All you need is pure, clean water. That would be sattvic. A sattvic fulfillment of the desire. Similarly, it is with all of our desires. We can move upward through the chakras. We don't want to listen to music. Well, that's natural, and maybe it's unnecessary, but it's a natural desire. But we can listen to second chakra music, or we can listen to third chakra music, or we can refine our tastes and go fourth, fifth chakra music, and we're still satisfying our desires, but we're becoming more refined in our tastes, and thus freeing ourselves from moving from the gross to the subtle, moving from the iron chains to the copper chains, or the bronze chains, to the gold chains. Eventually, the yogis will tell us that we have to get rid of all the chains, even the golden ones. But that's not our problem now. Now our problem is the iron chains. So we can focus on that. That's enough to occupy us for this life and the next. So how do we get rid of desire? How to manage desires? That's we could think in terms of sublimation. Another way is that we can use the way of the ancient yogis. And that is that it would be in the spiritual life, one of the first instructions of spiritual life is that in fact desires will be a problem. And therefore, the instruction is that while we are beginners in spiritual life, and we're all just beginners, it would be good advice for us to, just as you plant a young tree out in the field, that it would be good for you to fence that tree around. Otherwise, it will be eaten by deer and by animals. Therefore, we have to be proactive. We have to take preventive measures if we're serious about attaining inner freedom is what we're talking about. In order to achieve that freedom, we have to take preventive measures in our life. And that means is that we have to be forward-looking. We have to anticipate situations that will cause desires to arise. This is the way the yogis think. That is, once you are, let's say you're asleep in your bed at night, and you hear that there is a thief has entered into your house, and he's rummaging around downstairs. He's already in your house. It's really too late. You're already in difficulty. Your mind is already in turmoil, and you're already in confusion, and you've already lost. Therefore, it would be the best way to deal with such a situation would be to be proactive and make sure that it never happened. Avoid the possibility that such a situation would arise. And that's why spiritual aspirants don't watch TV, for example. Spiritual aspirants, maybe that you have nothing to do in the afternoon, maybe you go down and walk around the mall and look at stuff. And what happens? Well, naturally when you return home, you have a whole mental list of things that you remembered that you saw we've already linked, they already formed a link of attachment to those things, and soon we will act on that desire. That is the prior intention has already been formed. Now all we have to do in the circumstances is intention in action. That is the cycle will complete, and we will fulfill our desires. So this is something about how we can manage how we can manage. The good news is that we can manage our desires, and that we can take giant steps forward towards spiritual progress and progress in personal growth, and towards living well by reducing our desires and by a minimalist perspective on life. That's the good news. The bad news is that you can never get rid of these desires. The bad news is the only person who is free from desire is a saint or a sage who has realized his true self. That's the only way. The only person that's free is a jivan mukta. That means a person who is living free from all those different kinds of, has all that freedom, that he has moksha. He alone is free from desire. Why? Because he's realized his true self. All our desires spring from that fundamental ignorance, avidya. That's the root cause, which all of different kinds of practices don't deal with the root cause, which is avidya. It's only when we remove that is ignorance of our true nature. In your true nature, you know the fundamental teaching of the Vedanta philosophy, that you are a divine immortal soul, that you are infinite, that you contain everything within yourself. You don't need to find and look for anything outside. Only everything is within. That's self-realization. That is the ideal of spiritual life, to attain self-realization and become a jivan mukta, and to become free of all desires. So I think we'll stop here.